How's it going, YouTube? My name's LBNinja7, your resident Mistweaver monk, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about which Mythic Plus bosses this season are actually the hardest to heal. Now, I want to get this out of the way, but there is actually no way for me to make this video without some sort of bias. So if you disagree with this list or you think that I have it misordered, absolutely let me know down in the comments below. But once again, it's gonna be slightly biased. However, I am taking into account that these bosses are the ones that you guys ask me the most questions about. Now, without further ado, we're gonna skip the honorable mentions because you'll notice that I kind of cheat some extra ones in here. But let's go ahead and start with the number 5 slot, and it's actually two bosses because they kind of fill the same role, and although they're completely separate fights, they both challenge the healer in the same exact way. And these two bosses are the final boss of Uldaman and the final boss of Ruby Life Pools. Now, no, I'm not talking about them both just including a dragon in the fight, but what both of these fights do to the healer, the stress that they put on the healer, is they both require a high amount of throughput in order to get the job done, while also muddying up the room, which can make your life as the healer challenging or more challenging in a few different ways. For starters, me personally, I obviously play a melee healer. In both of these fights, I always get asked, how do I personally deal with these bosses when they constantly make you step away from the boss and still keep that high throughput? Because with Ruby Life Pools, you have those puddles flying all over the room. You can't step in them or it'll just snowball and get so much worse and just like become almost unhealable or almost unkillable. And then in Uldaman, sometimes your ranged players play a bit too close to you and cut you off so that you have to either stand in the breath or just run to the other side of the sand, and it's kind of out of your control. And once again, you still have to maintain that high amount of throughput or people will just rot away. And on top of that, each of these bosses have a mechanic that causes 1 or even 3 players to take exceptionally more damage. And if you get pulled away from the boss at the wrong time and your ally that gets one of these dots on them doesn't pop a defensive, it can just be hellish or nightmarish and just cause you as the healer to just have to make a decision. Do I let this person rot away, or do I roll through the bad stuff, or what happens? And that's a struggle that melee healers have to face. But also on that same note, ranged healers also go through a similar struggle, but instead of their own positioning, they have to worry about their allies' positioning. Because if you're, say, a preservation evoker and your shadow priest decides to, instead of kiting this way around the puddles, they kite that way around the puddles, they're just going to die. Like, there's nothing you can do. You have to put yourself in harm's way, and in high keys, that just cannot slide. So not only do these fights require a high amount of execution from all players, and failure to do so just directly impacts how difficult these bosses are to heal, but these bosses also just are stressful to heal. But speaking of stressful on the healer, that leads us to our number 4 slot, which is Chargath of Neltharis. Also known as the Chain Boss, or, a nightmare, a walking nightmare. This boss is terrifying and so hard to heal. Now, on the surface, this boss doesn't really have too many mechanics for you to balance as the healer. However, this is one of the few bosses this season that has one giant spot heal requirement followed by a giant AoE healing requirement. But this boss is pretty unique, with the spot heal requirement being Dragon Strike, a massive bleed that he'll put on one of the DPS or even yourself, and it will carry into that AoE healing phase, causing that one person to require even more healing than the rest of your party. It is scary. But speaking of scary, this guy becomes Michael Myers and just chases your tank during binding spears. And as you know, this phase of the boss will end as soon as he walks through 3 of his chains or breaks 3 of the tethering binding spears on your DPS. You as the healer will have to heal through the burst damage that these chains do when they break. And what makes this boss absolutely terrifying is a couple of factors, but mainly, if your tank can't handle the amount of tank damage that's coming into him during this phase for too long, they will want to break multiple chains at a time, and you as the healer are going to have to find a way to keep everyone alive. Now, this phase happens once roughly every minute, so your 1 minute cooldown is already locked in, guaranteed to be up for this phase. However, you're going to have to couple it with some of your 2 or 3 minute cooldowns. And if you choose the wrong set of chains to put your 3 minute cooldown on, or your 2 minute cooldown on top of your 1 minute cooldown, and then the next set your tank decides to pop all three chains in quick succession, then you know what? Best of luck. You are screwed. Now, on top of that, on top of the, semi-random nature from a healer's point of view of these chains popping and the incoming AoE damage, there's also Dragon Strike. It doesn't go away. It lasts for most of this phase, so that one person is just going to be melting even faster than everyone. And on top of that, so is your tank. So is your tank. Depending on what class your tank is playing, some of the tank specs can deal with this mechanic a lot easier. I've seen Blood Death Knights just sit in this phase because they can just heal back every strike from the boss. However, I've seen Brewmasters get one shot through 2 defensives. So yeah, the tank damage is terrifying, the single target damage is terrifying, and so the AoE damage can be too. So that is why this boss lands here, but once again, it's a little circumstantial, so that's why it lands still at number 4 on this list. Now we're gonna move on to the final 3, and no more cheating, there are just 3 bosses left, and these 3 are also non-circumstantial, meaning that I recognize that the previous 2, or I guess 4 that we talked about, kind of require something to go wrong in order for them to become, worthy of being on this list. But these top 3 alone can discourage you from running these dungeons as a whole on Tyrannical Week. That's how terrifying these 3 bosses are. And to kick things off, we're going to talk about Veximus, which is one of the first 3 bosses of Algeth'ar Academy, and I'm sure you have lost a couple of allies to this boss. Now, on the surface, this boss's mechanics are pretty unassuming. If you just take them at their face value on paper, sure, you can deal with them as a healer. You can kind of align your spells and your cooldowns to deal with each of the mechanics pretty easily in your head. But then you actually pull the boss, and in practice, this boss is a lot harder than it seems. Because how it works is there are some mechanics that this boss does on basically a timer. It's going to happen the same time every fight. And then the last mechanic, Arcane Fissure, happens when this boss reaches 100 energy. And what happens is the 2 hardest mechanics, Mana Bombs and Arcane Fissure, the 2 ones that both can do about half, or at least a little over, a little under half of your ally's health, those can both, and they will both, overlap if you don't do specific things to stop it from happening. So basically, if you don't allow the boss to get energy quicker than normal, or just normal than its energy generation, you'll come to a moment in the fight where the boss will cast Arcane Fissures as Mana Bombs are being applied, and as the healer, that kind of comes back on you. You don't really have any power over if this overlap happens or not, yet you are the one that has to heal through it. And a lot of times, one cooldown is not enough to save all 3 of your Mana Bomb allies. And also, on top of that, normally you can just deal with Mana Bombs by standing still and casting. For example, as a Mistweaver Monk, we can cast Shayloon's Gift into one of those 3 people and save them all, top them up really quickly before that big slam happens. However, since it's paired with Arcane Fissure, that slams you, knocks you back, and then spawns swirlies under your feet. So now all of a sudden that's less of an option. That's a much more risky option to plant and cast a Shayloon's Gift, or plant and spam Vivifies to save these allies, or cast Regrowth into these allies. Your options are a lot more limited. However, once again, there is a caveat, and that's why this is number 3 and not one of the top 2. You can avoid this overlap by allowing one of the orbs to get into the boss to allow it to get energy quicker and kind of offset these spells. But that's also just the overlap. That's the scariest point in this fight. However, the rest of the fight is also pretty difficult. I mean, the orbs themselves, there's so many different ways that these can be handled. For example, if you have even a hunter or a paladin in your group, they can just immune and go soak them all, and then you just don't have to worry about them. If you have a gamer of a tank, they can just go soak 2, you can dispel them, then they can go soak 2 more, and then boom, there's only 1 more for you to deal with. However, in most groups, everyone's going to soak 1, and as the healer, you just have to be on top of your dispel button, on top of being on top of the healing, and things kind of add up and can spiral out of control really quick. And by the time that things have spiraled out, that is when the overlap hits and just nukes one or two or even three of your allies. Hell, I mean, you could even wipe to that overlap. It's that scary. So that is why Veximus has landed at the number 3 spot on this list. But I'm sure some of you out there can guess what the top two are, probably in the order, or maybe you're thinking of one that I don't even have on this list. I know some people are going to be pretty mad about some of the Nako defensive bosses not being on this list. Spoiler alert. But let's go and get into the number 2 slot, and that is the third boss from, yes, you guessed it, Uldaman. I'm sure some of you said another dungeon. That is probably coming up soon. Once again, spoiler alert. But the third boss to Uldaman is absolutely terrifying. And for some of you guys, you can deal with this boss a lot easier because you have one spell or one tool in your toolkit that can deal with one of the main mechanics of this fight a lot easier. However, your role as the healer in this boss is actually pretty simple. You have to be able to spot heal the person that gets the bleed on them enough to where the big AoE slam won't kill them, and then also top everyone up after or before that slam so they don't die to it. Which on paper is it's not that bad compared to some of these other things. It's really not that bad. However, once you get into hierarchies and you see just how hard this bleed can melt through your allies, then you'll start to understand why a lot of people fear Uldaman during Tyrannical weeks. And also, since we've already mentioned an Uldaman boss, that's why I call this the hardest Tyrannical dungeon, because there's two bosses that I think are very challenging, especially once you don't have them mastered. But this boss in particular, like I said, that bleed can melt your allies. It requires either you to use one of your externals on them while also slamming spot healing into them. I mean, in higher keys, you have to literally only spot heal them, but it also demands that they themselves press a defensive. And since this mechanic is, semi-random, it can go onto the same ally literally 3 times in a row. I've seen it happen so many times to where they're out of defensives, you're out of externals, and they're just screwed. At that point, the only thing that can save them is one of the utility buttons that can deal with that bleed, or a battle res. And that's so ridiculous. But then on top of that, like I said, there is a giant AoE slam, and this slam absolutely trucks. And in higher keys, this also requires some amount of defensive utility, either a shield, damage mitigation, something to survive it as well. So if you're using your defenses for the big AoE slam and then you get caught with your pants down and you get the bleed on yourself, you are screwed. However, like I said, some classes do have tools to deal with this mechanic a lot easier. So for example, Evokers can remove the bleed with Cauterizing Flame, and Paladins have both Divine Shield that they can put on the ally that gets it, or Blessing of Protection each of those will get rid of the bleed. Or I guess just ignore the bleed in somehow, some way. However, put yourself in the shoes of a Discipline Priest. Yes, you have 2 charges of Pain Suppression, but you also kind of, in higher keys, you're kind of forced to use a fully powered penance into one of your allies for spot healing, and then the big AoE slam happens, and you don't have penance in order to heal that. This boss it's just very difficult. It puts a lot of strain on what you as the healer are capable of doing, and that's why it lands on the list at this spot. And then finally, the hardest boss to heal this season, as if I didn't spoil it already. Guys, you know the one. I'm sure everyone's been thinking it this whole entire video, but it's the third boss of Halls of Infusion. This boss is a nightmare on Tyrannical Week. And it's really interesting because it doesn't really have the normal boss mechanics that other bosses have. Other bosses, they'll have things like Wing Buffet, big slams of damage that you as the healer have to be prepped for, have everyone topped for, and heal through that. However, this boss, like I said, it doesn't have that. It doesn't have those big slams of damage other than like one-shot mechanics that you can simply just dodge. However, throughout the fight, everyone is continuously ticking. And I don't just mean like ticking for a minor amount of damage. Everyone is rotting away, losing years off of their life. They are just slowly dying. And it is specifically your job as the healer to keep them alive. And what makes this boss a lot more, difficult, like I said, it's a combination of those two things. Being different from other bosses while also just rotting you away. So on a normal boss, you would combat that big slam of damage with one of your cooldowns. However, what this boss calls from you or requires you to do, the basically the question that it poses to you is completely different in the sense that you have to space out your cooldowns so that they get their full value. For example, as a Mistweaver, if I pop Chi-Ji and get everyone to full health, and then Chi-Ji, goes away, its time runs out, so it just leaves. Then after a few seconds, everyone kind of rots down, takes like 2 ticks, they're down to 80%. If I press revival, then that is a waste. 5% of that revival will go to overhealing. Instead, you're supposed to let everyone rot down to like 60%. That way you can heal them. Also, on other bosses, when all the damage is kind of compacted into one instant burst of damage, it allows you as the healer to squeeze in some damage buttons during that downtime. However, this boss doesn't offer you that luxury. There is no downtime. Every single button that you press has to be the most efficient way to get the most healing in that moment at all times, or someone will die, someone will rot away. If you or your allies do not use your defensive between your major cooldowns, like if your whole group is not playing around your cooldowns, someone will rot away. If you press your cooldowns, slightly too close together, you will be caught with your pants down in 30 seconds time when your Chi-Ji has 5 seconds left on its cooldown. This fight is punishing, and it is all down to the healer to keep them up. But like I said, there is some things that your party can do. Like for example, you can have Vampiric Embrace kind of catch you back up in the healing at some points between your cooldowns from your Shadow Priest. Augmentation Evokers can alleviate a lot of this pain. If you go with an off-meta tank like a Guardian Druid or a Prot Paladin, they can also help as well. But for the most part, just a general statement, this boss is a nightmare for healers. But like I said, this boss is doable. Obviously, there are people doing like plus 19s of this dungeon, plus 18s and 19s of this dungeon. So this boss is healable. It's just, it requires so much more coordination than other bosses because this is just a pure healing check, and it will stress you out. If you are not stressed on this boss, then you should be doing a higher key level. It's that difficult. But guys, that's going to do it for this list. I'm sure some of it was predictable. I might have caught you off guard with some of these choices, but if I did, let me know which ones of these you think shouldn't be on the list or what you think should be on the list in their place. But I want to give a quick thank you to the patrons of this channel, because without them, videos like this, or any video for that matter, would not be possible. I wouldn't be able to maintain such a small channel as mine and continue making videos like this that I enjoy making if it weren't for these guys. So if you want to see your name alongside them, check out that Patreon link down in the description below. And also, while you're down there, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this with one of your healer friends to see what they have to say about it. But guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, take care.